Every day I seem to open up something and there is a talk about carbon in our farming business. There's a new word, there's all this terminology. We basically need a carbon dictionary. So what I'm trying to do is just demystify some of the words that we use. Why do we measure carbon? Traditionally, we've measured carbon to have a look at the function of our soil. So we've been really focusing on how this affects our productivity. How can we grow biomass to put carbon into our soils? But probably the last 10, 15 years, the focus has started to become on carbon accounting. So we've been interested in about emission reductions, sequestration, so we can do that in our vegetation or our soils. And now we're talking about carbon neutrality. So these are all these new terminology that's coming around. When we want to be carbon neutral, we're looking at a business or an organisation that is choosing to reduce their climate impact to zero. So that's net zero that we hear. Who's heard of carbon positive? New term that keeps on being used. I keep on thinking that's a bad thing, that you're emitting too much carbon, but carbon positive means that you're actually going beyond net zero and storing carbon in your system. So we've got net zero, we've got carbon neutral, we've got carbon positive. So there's all these terms and we're hearing them all in the media all the time. We want to be carbon neutral, so we want to just have our climate impact back to zero. We first need to calculate our greenhouse gas emissions, and Mark mentioned it before, we need to have a carbon footprint. Once we have our carbon footprints, we are then trying to reduce these emissions on farm as much as we possibly can. What we can't change or what we can't reduce, we then have to offset. So we either have them with sequestration on farm, or we have them, we have them by looking at purchasing carbon offsets. Now, we were really lucky to have Jem Barwick within PIRSA manage to get us some carbon footprints of two of the research centres. So we had Loxton and we had Turretfield. And for those who don't know, Turretfield is livestock grazing, predominantly sheep. So we went through with Integrity Ag and Environment, who are doing the majority of carbon footprints. I just wanted to mention too that I will make all of these slides available by PDF so that you can have a look afterwards, so you can have these numbers. We were lucky to have Integrity Ag and Environment do this, and Tracy's had these guys out for the Tatiara project, and I see that Eliza is advertising one for the Murraylands as well. They're a really good company. So when you get a carbon footprint, you get all this information. And it's quite interesting to have a look at what the breakdown of your emissions are in scope 1, 2 and 3. So scope 1 basically is the emissions that you have on your farm or on your business that is occurring, so you have control over those. Your scope 2 emissions basically are greenhouse gas emissions from electricity, so that's just all to electricity by itself. Your scope 3 are those emissions that normally occur with things that you import. So they're the fertilisers. So that comes with a cost to using them. So you get a breakdown of all your scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. You also get this breakdown by your greenhouse gas. So you can see you've got methane, you've got nitrous oxide, you've got carbon dioxide. So there are 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And you might not be able to see it on here, but unsurprisingly, being a grazing one, methane had the largest contribution. 80% of these emissions come from methane gas. So the pie chart there gives you an idea of what you can do. You are then able to start working out what options you can have to reduce the emissions you have or to start sequestering. If you can't sequester on site, you then have to purchase credits. The only way that we're often purchasing credits now is through carbon credit units. So they come through the Emissions Reduction Fund. They did actually change their name to the Climate Solutions Fund, but I don't think anybody uses it. So if you hear about the ERF, these are these carbon credit units. To be able to get carbon credit units, ACCUs, you need to participate in a methodology that has emission reduction or sequestration projects that are listed. These ACUs can be sold to generate income. So this is what we're all hearing about carbon trading. And you can either sell them to the government or in a secondary market. Just be aware that you cannot have a contract and sell your ACCUs to the government and then use them to be carbon neutral. It's double dipping. So you can either do an either or situation. Your contracts that you can get with the Clean Energy Regulator are fixed, and this was in early auctions. This is what everybody was choosing to do. So in that way, you were obligated to, for the seller to deliver the agreed quantity of carbon credit units to the government. There seemed to be this other contract optional now. So this basically sets a base price. So it offers the right to sell them to the government, but you don't have to. So if you've got more funding or a better offer from somewhere else, you can take that. And we'll talk about carbon prices in a minute. You don't actually have to have a contract at all. So this seems to be a lot more popular in probably the last 12 months. So basically you're still providing an offset and audit report. So you're going through all of it. You have to register your project and you're doing all of that. You will get carbon credit units issued, but they will not be purchased by the government because there is no contract. But you can sell these on a secondary market or directly to other parties. They've gone through a rigorous process, so they're kind of guaranteed units. So I don't know a huge amount about this, but it looks like this seems to be the way that people seem to be going. It's not too clear on the screen there, but basically what I did was went onto the emission reduction website yesterday and had a look at how many contracts we have listed. So South Australia now has 57 projects listed. 15 of them are in vegetation, and now we have 29 in agriculture. 28 of them are soil carbon projects now. What the really interesting part was, there's only 15 of these are actually contracted. The rest are all the rest of the 47 or 42, whatever that number says, they're on non-contracts. So I think it's starting to set up this secondary market price. I had a look at these back for a presentation back in March last year. We had 14 soil carbon contracts for South Australia listed. There was one biogas, so this is under the agricultural methods one. Of the 6,000 odd carbon credit units that we've had credits to South Australia, that was all under the Brinkley Biogas Flaring Project. We haven't had any soil carbon credits come out yet. When we look to February, so just the other day, we've doubled the number of soil carbon projects that are listed. We still have the one biogas. So in reality, when I look back at the years that they were done, we had about 5 projects pre-2020. And so we've had about 23 projects from 2020. So there's been a lot of interest in soil carbon. What we have to remember for soil carbon is basically a 5-year break from the time that you register a project to the time that you have to take that measurement for your first one before we will start to see carbon credit units being issued if we are increasing carbon. These results, this graph here shows, we've got 2 graphs. So what we have are the possibility of where we sell our credits to. So the first one we have is if you've participated in a contract with the ERF, you have auction results. The last auction was in October 2021, and the price was $16.94 for a tonne of carbon per hectare that we have. Interestingly enough, there's a spot price on carbon credit units. So this is this secondary market that we're talking about. We've got it, there's a website that I just found, Jarden Australia there has graphed the price of carbon that has occurred. Until about early 2020, these carbon prices on the spot market were fairly similar to what we were seeing with the auction prices. They were slightly higher, but were going along a similar trend. They've started increasing, and at the end of last year, they really boomed. So the top price in February 2022 was $56.75 per tonne. And so just on last Tuesday, the price was $51.50. $50 a hectare used to be the price that was that nominal figure where it kind of was going to become attractive for farmers to engage in carbon farming. So that's something to keep aware of. When we're talking about ERF things, we really need to think about the methods. So there are a number of methods that include reduction and sequestration. What's the best one that you use for your property? CSIRO have developed a fantastic cool tool called Look-See. So it's LOOC-C. It's about, if you identify what area you're in, it will come up with some vegetation or carbon models, so any of the methodologies that may be suitable for your place. It's a good one-stop to get an idea of what might be suitable. At this stage, you can't have a vegetation and soil carbon project on the same piece of land. So if you put in a windbreak and you get a vegetation above ground sequestration project, at this stage you cannot test the soil carbon underneath it. They are looking at changing these. A really good thing that's going to come about is in 2022, so this year, they're looking at what's called stacked carbon methods. So traditionally there's been, if you have a vegetation and you have a soil carbon and you have a biogas project, that's 3 different projects you'd have on your property. That comes with 3 different lots of admin costs, all of the rigmarole that comes with that. What they're trying to do is fast track these to have a stack method so you have 1 set of admin and 1 lot of reporting for it. So that will make things a lot more attractive to take on. When we're talking about soil carbon projects, things that we have to remember are that the project needs to be registered before we do any baselining, any soil sampling, or applying any activity that is different. So be aware if you want to change something, register your project first. Your crediting period can be 25 or 100 years. Surprisingly, I don't know anybody who's gone for the 100-year option. Just be aware, though, that there is a permanence obligation period of 100 years. So at the end of your 25 years crediting period, what your carbon value is there needs to remain for another 75 years. So you still have to put in a report. I think it's every 10, 15 years to maintain that. How they might be able to track that, I'm not sure, given changes and that might happen. So baseline period, to be eligible, you have to have a certain amount of information about stocking rates, emissions, fertilisers you've applied. It used to be 10 years, they've now reduced that back to 5 years. So just be aware if you're looking for it, you need to have good 5 years of data. Now, Mark mentioned it before about discounting. So when we talk about a soil carbon price, we were talking about $16 per tonne, but there are a lot of discounts that we have to be aware of. So firstly, if we did have this great soil land and we changed over 5 years, we increased the carbon concentration by 0.5% in carbon. I've got a heap of assumptions there about what the bulk density and all of these other things are, but that's going to equate to about 7.7 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare. So when we have that number, we then immediately will apply a discount. So we have 5% for uncertainty. Mark said that we have an uncertainty factor because the measure is hard. So we drop down to 7.32 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. We then, because we've taken a 25-year contract, we have a 25% discount. That's because we've gone, carbon stays around for 100 years, we've gone a quarter of that time. We are then, because we're measuring our greenhouse gas emissions for the 5-year sampling period, if we have had more emissions than we've been able to sequester or that's gone above our baselining value, we then also have to take those values off of this, have a discount of that as well. I haven't included that because they could be very variable. And then if you have a carbon broker, you have a carbon broker fee. Now, I've spoken to a number of people. I don't know any of the exact measurements, but somewhere between 15 and 25% is a value. So I've just used 20% of a carbon broker fee. So we've gone from 7.7 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent that we managed to secure in our place down to 4.39 tonnes of carbon dioxide that would be paid for. So if we looked at that credit price, the ACCU of $16.94, that will give us after discount or before discounts of 130 and after of 74. What we also have to remember is that we haven't managed to pay, in this we haven't managed to pay for any of the baseline soil sampling, the follow-up soil sampling, or the independent land management report that you also need to do. So if we're looking at the price of $16, we got $74. If we are going to that $50, we're looking at more like $220 a hectare. So in this part, it is starting to seem like the numbers might be stacking up. So just be aware that there is what we actually can grab in what we can store in our soils and what we will actually get paid for are different things, okay? So just be aware of all of that. Other things when we're talking about it, Mark's pretty much covered most of these. When we talk about carbon concentration from the lab tests we get, they're in %. We talk in carbon stock for carbon accounting. 1 tonne of carbon per hectare is normally spoken about in carbon dioxide equivalents. Multiply 1 tonne of carbon by 3.67 and you'll get your carbon dioxide equivalents. And carbon units, carbon accounting is in the top 30 centimetres of soil. Another thing too, we live in a special state. South Australia has the best soils, of course, but we also have carbonate. And when we're talking about it, Mark was saying, when we have total carbon in our soils, we have an inorganic form. So the carbonate that we see, the white stuff that gives us that fizz, can create problems for this carbon accounting. It's not included in any of them. And so some of the tests that we use can measure this. So when we use organic carbon, it's normally called a Walkley-Black method that we get on our soil tests. We can't use that because it doesn't measure all the carbon in our soils. It's often only about 75 to 90% of the total organic carbon in our soils. So be aware that we are using different tests. So with carbon accounting, we need to measure total organic carbon, and this is by a lot of different machines, but one of them is called a LECO. You'll hear a lot of people talk about LECO carbon. If your pH is generally below 7.5 and you don't have any fizz, you don't have any carbonate in your soil, you'll hear that a total carbon test will be suitable. It's equivalent to total organic carbon. But as soon as we get a hint of carbonate in the soil, can be above about 7.5, low to medium fizz if you put a little bit of acid on there, you will need to ask for a total organic carbon test with acid pre-treatment. What we found when we were doing some studies in the MDV, we were sending off samples to different labs, and depending, a lot of out-of-state labs were actually not getting rid of all of the carbonate in the soil. So when they were applying that fizz, they were leaving some carbonate in there. So we had some very big difference in values. So if you do have a lot of carbonate in your soils, make sure that your person doing the sampling needs to talk to the lab and just tell them that it needs to be done well. APAL is doing a fantastic job of actually making sure that the results are coming back as well. Okay, that was our original break time, but we're powering through. So, sorry, it's information overload. Now we get to talk about the fun stuff. How to accumulate carbon in our soil. So I'll skip through a bit of this quickly. Mark's done a fantastic job in covering a lot of this. So soil carbon, we're talking about total carbon. As I said before, we have inorganic carbon in our soil, the carbonate. It's not included in carbon accounting because generally it doesn't change with management practices. Apart from, of course, if we apply lime to our soils, which will cause an increase. What we focus on is the organic carbon component, so anything that has been animal, plant, microbial origin, living or dead in our soils makes up organic carbon. And of course, this is greatly influenced by our management practices. So why is carbon important? As Mark said, carbon is a part of organic matter. When we're talking about this, we have to keep on remembering that it's organic matter. It's more than just carbon. It's about the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the sulphur, some of the micronutrients. It's about the benefit that organic matter provides us. So we get a bit slack and we just call it shorthand soil carbon, but it is organic matter. Why are we interested in organic matter in our soils? And it really is about soil health and function. So having these robust soils that can be more resilient, that bounce back from adverse events such as drought or fire. When we talk about soil function, we have 5 key functions that we're interested in that are underpinned by carbon. The first one is biomass or productivity of our soils. There's nutrient cycling, so this is about having the availability of the nitrogen, the phosphorus that is available when the microbes break down the organic matter. We then have water cycling, so we either have storage or infiltration in our soils, and this is because we have better structure with better organic matter. It's important to have species diversity, so all of this below ground biomass that we're having with all the microbes in there is really important for pest and disease, and it's critical for the turnover and energy provision of these microbes. And one of those 5 functions comes out as offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon pool regulation is a function as well. The question is, can we increase soil function and increase organic carbon for climate mitigation, or do we need to have a balance in these questions? And that's probably one of the reasons that you need to ask yourself about why you're interested in increasing carbon. Is it to focus on just greenhouse gas emissions, or is it about a whole state of improving function of our soils? Now, these are the pools that Mark spoke about, and this This little diagram is taken from one of Jeff Baldock's examples. Really, the critical parts are that there are 3 pools that we were talking about that Mark was said. Particulate is also called active, labile or fresh carbon. It's really critical for the soil functioning part. So most of the soil function is occurring in this particulate fraction. This turnover and nutrient provision is in there. We then have the humus-like fraction, also heard of as stable or recalcitrant carbon. And that is, that's what we're focusing more on when we're talking about greenhouse gas mitigation. And we have that resistant fraction, which is our charcoals. So what factors influence carbon in our soils? So we start with this fantastic potential carbon right up the top there. It's defined by what our soil types are, basically down by our texture, our mineralogy and the density of our soils. Then we have these things which are climatic conditions often, so rainfall and temperature are some of the biggest ones in South Australia that then bring that potential down to a limiting factor. Then we have management practices and they reduce this value down to these actual carbon values that we see. So we start right up here and because of these limitations we step down. So how do we get carbon into our soils? Basically, as Mark said, it comes from growing plants. So we've got plant residue, the shoots above the ground and the roots below ground. We also have the rhizodeposition, so the root exudates that comes from photosynthesis, goes through as sugars that gets exuded into the roots and feeds this soil biology. We also have living and dead soil biology, so the microbes, and it can make up, so living biology can make up as much as 1 to 5%, and dead, I've seen recent ones saying as much as 30% of the carbon in our soils. We also have inputs from manures, plant residues that we might apply, and urine from livestock. And we have fire, so we have that charcoal component. Probably one of the biggest things though is that we have decomposition losses that are between 70 and 90% of the carbon we input into our soil. So there is a big turnover. And when we're talking about soil function and having nutrients in there, we want this turnover. We want to have those nutrients being made available. But we do also need to probably start focusing on what microbes are probably a little bit more efficient so we can end up as having decomposition losses closer to 70 rather than 90%. So our soils have this set capacity to stabilise carbon. If you stabilise carbon, so from this we're trying to protect them from decomposition from microbes. If you have a lot of carbon, if you have particularly a sandy soil, you add in carbon either from compost, from growing your plants, and it's free, it's very easy or susceptible to decomposition by microbes. So your risk is high of having a high turnover. If you can bind the carbon in your soils, and this is normally in that humus-like or that stable component, they can bind onto things like your clay minerals in the soils, can also be on iron or aluminium. This protects them from decomposition, so they're much more likely to stay in your soil. The other thing that you can do is have, when we have good structure, so when we're talking about organic matter and having structure, when we're improving those crumbs or having aggregates in the soil, they're also protected, and that's often in that particulate fraction. So if we can protect the carbon from, or stabilise that carbon from decomposition, we have a much greater chance of storing carbon in our soils rather than just turning it over. So what we know about carbon, thanks to Dew, last year we released this report, so it's looking at carbon benchmarks across the agricultural zone from 1990 to 2007. There is a link on the page, or I'm happy to send people the PDF if they're interested in following up. What we were able to do was, back in the day when the government ran an analytical lab, we had over 36,000 soil test results that had carbon tested in the top 10 centimetres. So this graph here shows the values from 1990 to 2007. The key things here is down the bottom we have time, and up the axis there we have the carbon, organic carbon test of the Walkley Black, and it's of the topsoil. So overall, in all of the soil tests, we found that over this time we had an increase in carbon of 0.08% in 0.08% per year. That's the grey line along there in the middle. What we can see is we were able to break that down into land use. There's a green line up the top, which shows pasture. They actually increased carbon at a higher rate of 0.11% per year. We have orchard and vineyard as well down the bottom there. It was very variable, so we weren't able to get a trend on that. But the blue line down the bottom here shows cropping. And although that it was lower than the pasture at 0.04% per year, it was still positive. So cropping often gets the thing that we're going backwards. During the period that we were looking at here between 1990 and 2007, when we had no-till, adoption of no-till and stubble retention, we were seeing an increase in carbon. But when we think about measuring those values, that's quite a small change. So that's why when we talk about looking at carbon, we are talking about periods of 5 or 10 years. For each of the agricultural districts, which are based on the PIRSA crop and pasture reports, we have a breakdown of what the carbon of the cropping areas are in there. We also have a breakdown of what the change is. So here we've got the Lower Murray and we've got Northern Murray. The comparison is for Lower Murray, increase of 0.07% per year. The Northern Murray was lower at 0.01%, but it was still a positive increase. The beauty about what we have now is, you can't see it here, but on there we have benchmarks now for carbon in the top 10 centimetres by soil texture. So we go through sands to loamy sands, sandy loams to clays. So what you can do is find your area that you're interested in, where your paddock comes from, compare your carbon results to these, and it will give you an idea of where you are in the benchmark between 25th, 40th, 50th and 75th percentile. And what we can do from that is then start to understand this opportunity to store more carbon in your soils. So there is definitely, as Mark said, a high potential to store carbon in soils when you start at a lower concentration or in this lower benchmark areas. If we have a target zone, which would be the 75th percentile of the benchmarks in your area, and you're sitting beneath the 50th benchmark, there is definitely a greater opportunity to increase carbon than there is if you were sitting at the higher end. We know that rainfall has a huge influence on carbon storage. In SA, no matter what database we're looking at, there is a sharp increase in carbon as soon as you hit that 500 to 550 mil rainfall. Regardless of texture, it just shoots up. So the one thing we have to also think about is ensuring that we have sufficient carbon inputs. Mark was saying growing plants, having biomass in there is the key way of getting us to increase more carbon. Now, Tim Herman's come up with this great calculator, which is very similar to Mark's, and I'll send this one out. But basically what we see here is we've got grain yield, so how much grain you would grow, to maintain a carbon level at a carbon percentage. So this line here, if we had 1% carbon in our soils, we would have to be generating about 1.5 to 1.6 tonnes of grain yield to just maintain the carbon that we have in that soil. Mark also suggested that we need to have sufficient nutrients in our soil to change from this particulate to the humus, so that active to that stable carbon. There is evidence that we need to have ratios of carbon. So Clive Kirkby has a ratio that's Hills from Ciro. To create 1 tonne of humus, you need about 80 kilograms of nitrogen, 20 kilos of P, and 14 kilograms of sulphur. Now this is above and beyond what we would have, as we were saying, to transform that into humus. Now, Tim did a quick back of the envelope calculation for me, and if we were just using synthetic nutrients, that would be about $300 worth. The proviso of that, when I'm looking at Kirkby's reports, was that this is generally only going to occur, this addition of nutrients is only going to occur when we have stubble loads above 12 tonnes per hectare. And presumably anything below that is probably limited by rainfall. So here we're getting into some real data. So this is thanks to the landscape, the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board, and this comes from the first and second year of us sampling. Over here, it's the importance of soil texture. So the first year we went out to 4 properties within a same paddock that had exactly the same management. We looked at a sandhill and we looked at the adjacent swale. So we had a sandy soil and we had a loamier soil. The blue ones that you can see are sands and the orange ones are the loamier soils. And in every situation, you have higher carbon storage under the same management in the same paddock under a loamy soil with higher clay concentration than you do on those sandy soils. So in reality, your sands can hold less carbon than what your loamier soils can. So we need to be realistic about how much we expect each of our textures to be able to hold. The following year we were looking at management practices, and so changing in management practices, especially if you're starting to introduce perennial crops or deeper rooting or have changed something in that root zone below 10 to 30 centimetres, where you sample is going to be incredibly important if you pick up a change. These first 2 here, it doesn't matter what management we have. When we measure just a 0 to 30, the blue one was higher than the orange one. When we went down to the 0 to 50, the orange one was higher than the blue one. So we were looking at a deeper root growth in that situation. So you have to be mindful of when you're measuring, and if you are going into an ERF market, about considering the extra depths that you might look at. Adverse soil conditions can create fake carbon results. If we have really acidic soils, we have saline soils, what we're doing is creating environments that prevent some biological activity from occurring. So any inputs that we're having is just falling onto the soil. What happens then, if we ameliorate this by either applying lime, we're kicking out the biological activity and all of a sudden this carbon that was stored disappears. It goes down. So you need to be mindful if you have any of these areas and you're talking about doing a carbon project. There is a lot of talk about the theory of carbon increase by management practices. If we go from a bare cultivated soil, which we definitely know has the lowest carbon, we start then doing practices of minimum or no tillage, stubble retention, we do adequate nutrition, and then the be-all and end-all is to hit this perennial pasture. That's the theory of carbon change and management. The Kangaroo Island Landscape Board was really interested in doing that. So we had 10 paired sites across their area, and they were looking at pastures, so they were either annual pasture or kikuyu, so perennial pasture, or a crop with no till stubble retention compared to an annual pasture. And we had 10 situations, so the detail in this doesn't matter. You can see 3 smiley faces on there. So out of those 3 out of those 10 situations, we actually adhered to what the theory said. So the management practice that was meant to be better was better. So that means 7 out of 10 times it wasn't always better. So it's not particularly about the management practice that is chosen, it's about how you manage that. So you could have an annual cropping system that can be better than a perennial pasture system if you have the right amount of cover, the length of time, etc., etc. So there's a lot in this. And Eliza, who's talking next, has this fantastic project that has a span of sites that she's been monitoring for a number of things that includes carbon. So this graph shows variability of carbon concentration over time. So down the bottom here, we have 2018, 19, 20 and 21. And then we have the blue line is the topsoil, 0 to 10. Then we go to 10 to 20 and 20 to 30. What we can see here is that there are there's variability, and each farm had different amounts of variability. Topsoils often have more variability than subsoils. Subsoils generally below 10 centimetres can be more stable. But it makes it really tricky. If you're looking to take this about 1, creating a trend in carbon, what's changing, and 2, oh sorry, I completely lost my track of thought there. So what we'll need is if you're doing a project, where you would actually take, which year would you take those results? Because if you had a wet year or a dry year or a drought year, it's going to depend on what your starting baseline might be. Be assured that change can take 5 to 10 years to be able to say succinctly if a change is occurring without having all of this variability. So really, accumulating carbon depends on the ability of the soil to stabilise carbon, really based on our soil texture, pretty much. You need the capacity of the carbon to be able to store more carbon. Check those benchmarks. You need to have the ability to grow sufficient biomass in your system. You need to make sure that your carbon inputs are more than your carbon outputs, so thinking about decomposition and erosion. The possibility to increase and maintain carbon inputs if we do ramp the system up. Can we keep this going? Otherwise the microbes will just eat it down again. And really, how do we get these carbon pools that stay in the soil for a long time? So how do we increase the longevity? So take-home thoughts really are, determine why you want to change carbon in your system. There are trade-offs for function if you're just focusing on greenhouse gas emission. Be realistic about how much you can change carbon in your soils. It's dependent on so many things: texture, rainfall, any limitations. So they could be inherent, it could be induced limitations of fertility. There is a lot involved in this. And just be aware that carbon is variable and needs a long time, so 5 to 10 years to really measure if a change is occurring. And that's me done. I'm happy if anybody wants to contact me by email or mobile to follow up, so that information will also be in the PDF.